Welcome to Convention of States, a project of citizens for self-governance. State sovereignty, our loss. Let's start with a definition of sovereignty. The authority of a state to govern itself, or self-governing. The states of the United States are supposed to be sovereign entities that run their own affairs with very little to no input or oversight from the federal government. Of course, that isn't how things are run today. The states have completely subjugated themselves to the federal government and allowed its citizens to be ruled. So, how did the states lose their sovereignty and self-rule? Well, we need to understand two concepts to answer this question as we proceed through this presentation. First is dual federalism, and second is implied powers doctrine. Dual federalism is a political arrangement in which power is divided between the federal and state governments in clearly defined terms, with state governments exercising those powers accorded to them without interference from the federal government. As we will see, this concept of dual federalism did not last. The implied powers doctrine. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. This clause is the source of the doctrine of implied powers, and it has been a cause of controversy from the very founding of the Republic. An implied power is one that is not specifically granted by the Constitution, but is implied by those that are. For example, the Constitution does not explicitly grant the power to develop and purchase aircraft, nuclear weapons, etc., for the armed forces. That power is implied in the power to declare war, maintain an army and navy. The point of contention in this case is over the meaning of the word necessary. Alexander Hamilton interpreted the meaning as authorizing any law that would facilitate the execution of an enumerated power. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, argued that it meant only those laws that the enumerated power could not be executed without. Legislatures have, throughout our history, taken the more liberal meaning in order to pass any law that they could somehow relate to an enumerated power, even if only a minor relationship. Well, we're back to the question of how did the states lose their sovereignty and self-rule? This primarily happened from a change in how the Constitution was viewed. It changed from a constitution of rights, both state and private, and was replaced by the view of a constitution of powers being granted to the federal government, or what has been deemed as the implied powers doctrine. Because the attitude of the Supreme Court changed towards certain facts of constitutional interpretation having to do with the federal system, and which in their totality they compromised dual federalism when dealing with the relation between the federal government and the states. The compromised constitutional facts are as follows. Number 1, the federal government is one of enumerated powers only. Number 2, it is only allowed to spend money for the purpose of carrying out these enumerated powers. Number 3, within their respective spheres, the two centers of government are sovereign and hence equal. Number 4, The relation of the two centers with each other is one of tension rather than collaboration. Let's take a closer look at each of the constitutional facts for a better understanding. Fact number one, the federal government is one of enumerated powers only. Today, the idea of the enumerated powers concept as a rule of constitutional interpretation has been diminished on every front. The state sovereignty concept was immediately attacked as soon as the people had safely ratified the Constitution. These attacks usually took the forms of distortions of the General Welfare Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause of the Constitution in relation to the federal government's enumerated powers. Necessary and Proper Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, which is the source for the Implied Powers doctrine. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Now, the General Welfare Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Continuing on with fact number one, the federal government is one of enumerated powers only, we find founders' confusion. One of the earliest things that we can point to for the view of the expansion of the federal power and spending was in 1791, when Alexander Hamilton issued his Report on Manufactures. Here, Hamilton outlined the powers that the federal government would have in taxing. It is therefore of necessity left to the discretion of the national legislature to pronounce upon the objects which concern the general welfare and for which, under that description, an appropriation of money is requisite and proper. And there seems to be no room for a doubt that whatever concerns the national interest of learning, of agriculture, of manufactures, and of commerce are within the sphere of the national councils as far as regards an application of money. Well, in Federalist 17, before the Constitution was ratified, Hamilton wrote that the supervision of agriculture and of other concerns of a similar nature, which are proper to be provided for by local legislation, can never be desirable cares of a federal government. Other founders also had conflicting views subsequent to the ratification. So you can see that unless you understand the original intent of the Constitution, our own history can be confusing as to what to believe concerning the federal government's powers. This is an area that needs clarification. Constitutional fact number 2. It is only allowed to spend money for purpose of carrying out enumerated powers. We now must ask the question, did the framers of the Constitution apportion the powers between the state and the federal government so as to keep the federal government from doing on a national scale what the states were already doing on a local scale? Sometimes when people read the preamble of the Constitution, it can sound like that is what the framers did envision. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. But the key question on the matter is, was Congress going to be allowed to levy and collect taxes for things that weren't in its sphere of power? Two questions. Was Congress allowed to lay and collect tariffs for any but revenue? Was it entitled to spend what it got from taxes on things other than what it was allowed to under its enumerated powers? Well, in 1928, the Supreme Court got around to giving their view on the subject and decided that, yes, the federal government did have the authority to tax and to spend outside of its sphere. And what did they point to that gave them this revelation? You guessed it, Hamilton's report on manufactures in 1791. Constitutional fact number 3. Within their respective spheres, the two centers of government are sovereign and hence equal. Well, this question is to be determined by two texts of the Constitution itself. The first part is Article 6, Clause 2, known as the Supremacy Clause, which reads as follows: This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. The second text is, in fact, the 10th Amendment, which states, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. The bottom line here is that it was the intention of the Federal Convention that national laws needed to be superior. Well, continuing on with constitutional fact number 3, this was also John Marshall's theory. The principle of national supremacy was, in his estimation, one of the most fundamental axioms of constitutional interpretation. If any one proposition could command the assent of mankind, one might expect it would be this: that the government of the Union, though limited in its powers, is supreme within its sphere of action. Well, no one is denying the supremacy of the Constitution, and national supremacy doesn't conflict with the 10th Amendment either. However, slowly over the course of years, the judiciary, through Supreme Court cases, has picked apart the guarantee to the states that it and the federal government were equal sovereigns. But even at this point, there were still a few areas that the states were left alone. These were the means of production, like mining, agriculture, manufacturing, and the employee-employer relationship. That is, until President Roosevelt and the New Deal came along. During the time of the New Deal, federalism was swept away. It was during this time that FDR was instituting his, quote, court pack threat to the Supreme Court that the last bit of sovereignty the states had disappeared. Today, there is absolutely no concept of federal equilibrium with the states in any ingredient of national legislation. Constitutional fact number 4. The relation of the two centers with each other is one of tension rather than collaboration. Discussing this point in today's political climate is pretty much doomed with the emergence of cooperative conception. According to this concept, the national government and the states are mutually complementary parts of a single governmental mechanism intended to solve problems through governmental force. National government has brought its strengthened powers over interstate commerce and communications to the point of taking over local policies of the states. The federal power, always in the guise of the public good, acts like a wrecking ball and wreaks havoc on states and local control. The national government holds out inducements, primarily of a monetary nature, to the states in what is referred to as grants in aid. These monetary inducements seduce the states to use their reserved powers to support certain objectives of national policy. In other words, the greater financial strength of the national government is joined to the wider coercive powers of the states. The only hitch being that they promise to jump through every single hoop laid down by Congress. With the changes that have happened to the concept of dual federalism, the system has been overwhelmed and submerged. Well, we now come to what is a familiar point in our presentations, and that is, what can we do? Well, our first suggestion, of course, is to hold an Article 5 Convention of States for the purpose of amending the Constitution. Another suggestion would be the repeal of the 17th Amendment. The Senate was supposed to be a sort of check and balance, but that disappeared when U.S. senators began to be voted into office by special interests and mobs demanding more from the people's treasury. The absolute right of the states to equal representation was wiped out when the 17th Amendment was declared ratified April 8, 1913. Next suggestion would be clarification of enumerated powers. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Historically, Congress and the Supreme Court have broadly interpreted the enumerated powers, especially by deriving many implied powers from them. This is an area that really needs clarification. Congressional override capability. Mark Levin's book, Liberty Amendments, suggests an oversight committee for review and approval of regulations and legislation. The last area would be clarification of clauses. Further clarification of the necessary and proper clause, as well as the general welfare clause. It is time to further define a number of areas in our Constitution. These are only suggestions. Actual proposals would be made at a convention of states. In closing, I would like to leave with you one of my favorite quotes. The founders gave us a legitimate path to save our liberty by using our own state governments to impose binding restraints on the federal government. It is time to dust off the tool the founders gave us in Article 5 and get started. Thank you.